You're listening to episode 93 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Philippe Goldin speaks with us about changes in the brain from meditation, why psychological studies deal with placebo effects, and parent-child mindfulness meditation training on family relationships. Hi everyone. It's been a very active few weeks with the release of the new Secular Buddhist Association website, and we're seeing active participation on both comments on the episode pages and in the discussion forum. Thank you very much for taking an active part in the engagement with others in the ongoing development of our secular Buddhist community. We have many exciting things coming soon, including upcoming interviews with Sue Blackmore, both Stephen and Martine Batchelor, John Peacock, and of course, ongoing talks with scientists like Dr. Rick Hansen on the frontiers of meditation's effects on the brain, so stay tuned. As we do talk about science and various developments in therapy, we need to make comparisons between meditation and other treatments. How does participation in a mindfulness-based stress reduction program, for example, compare to aerobic exercise for social anxiety? And is there a difference between what participants self-report and what we see happening in an fMRI scan? The results of these controlled, randomized studies have led to what is most effective and helpful to people's suffering. That's what it's all about, after all, and that's what I like about good science. It clearly and unambiguously demonstrates its usefulness with evidence. Our guest today, Dr. Philippe Goldin, completed his PhD in clinical psychology at Rutgers University, clinical psychology internship at the UC San Diego Consortium, and is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Psychology at Stanford University. His clinical research focuses on functional neuroimaging investigations of cognitive affective mechanisms in both healthy adults and in individuals with various forms of psychopathology, the effect of mindfulness meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy on neural substrates of emotional reactivity, emotion regulation, and attention regulation, and the effect of child-parent mindfulness meditation training on anxiety, compassion, and quality of family interactions. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice cocoa. It is December after all. And our guest today is Dr. Philippe Goldin. Philippe, thanks for being here. Appreciate your time.
Hi, greetings.
And what we wanted to do is talk to you today about your work with clinically applied effective neuroscience. But first, what I'd like to do is ask you a bit about your background and how you first encountered meditation.
Well, first of all, it's my mom who went off to India and Nepal when I was still in high school. And when she came back, she felt that it was very important for me to go explore Asia. So when I was a college student, I did my junior and senior year abroad in Nepal, where I encountered Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, studied Tibetan language, Nepali, Sanskrit, and spent time in monasteries and began meditating, doing retreats, learning Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, psychology. Then I came back to the United States through Europe, and eventually got into a PhD program in psychology at Rutgers, where I studied clinical psychology and neuroscience, and ended up doing a clinical internship at UC San Diego, the San Diego Veterans Hospital, and that's where I began learning brain imaging, functional magnetic resonance, fMRI imaging. And it was really when I moved to Stanford University as a postdoc that I began putting all these different things together. My love of the brain, clinical treatment, meditation, psychotherapy, and doing clinical trials, and began integrating all these different aspects of my life and started doing applied clinical neuroscience, you could say, or clinical translational work, trying to understand how different brain systems related to emotion, cognitive regulation, attention regulation, view of self are instantiated in the brain, in different brain circuits, and how those are modified with different forms of psychotherapy, different forms of meditation practice, both in healthy adults and adults with anxiety disorders.
Now, you've spoken about these topics before, and for folks who are listening to the podcast episode, I've embedded a couple of Philippe's talks from the Wisdom 2.0 conference recently, and another YouTube video as well on the cognitive neuroscience of mindfulness. Philippe, if you would speak with us for a moment just about that Wisdom 2.0 conference and your talk there. You spoke about mindfulness and the brain.
Yes. Well, there's a growing, an explosion, I should say, of interest in understanding how different forms of meditation impact different brain systems. Attention, emotion, view of self, the ability to regulate your emotions, decision-making, etc. And that particular conference was a manifestation of the interest of people in Silicon Valley and specifically people involved in tech, in how to bring the wisdom of meditation or contemplative practices into the workplace, both for the benefit of the employees and also for the company, and also to enhance well-being, innovation, creativity. So I think that's one of the foci of that conference.
It is. It was a very interesting talk, and you've done, and I think you mentioned this in there, a great deal of comparison work with mindfulness-based stress reduction, and very specific studies on particular types of interventions and how they compare with meditation. So, for example, you've done studies on randomized control trial of MBSR versus cognitive behavioral therapy for adults with social anxiety disorder. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, actually, that's a study that we're doing right now. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the gold standard form of psychotherapy, especially for major depression and anxiety disorders, as well as many other kinds of psychological problems. MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, is a program that has many different components or different practices put together by John Kabat-Zinn more than 30 years ago. And it's gained a huge interest both in terms of research domain and also in clinical practice. But I've done studies where we compared MBSR directly versus aerobic exercise, which is a very powerful form of stress reduction. We've also done separate studies on cognitive behavioral therapy. We're currently doing a randomized controlled trial of MBSR versus CBT for adults with social anxiety. Totally different mechanisms of change. Cognitive therapy is very much language, linguistic, reasoning, disputing the accuracy of thoughts, whereas the practices in MBSR do many things, but they do not rely so much on language, logic, disputation, analytic thinking. In fact, they're more about resting in awareness, using attentional engagement, attention regulation. And so we're looking at this in the context of people who are suffering with social anxiety, and we're using many different levels of analysis to look at genetics, brain systems that are changing, behavior, performance on computer tasks, self-report, and looking at changes in well-being and clinical severity.
Now, what kinds of controls do you put in place during these studies?
Well, for this one study that we just finished, it was a randomized control trial where participants were randomized either to standard mindfulness-based stress reduction programs in the community versus an aerobic exercise stress reduction program where we bought people gym memberships. And we tried to control for both doing individual training and group training, which is done in both programs. And we had the same duration. For the new study we're doing now, we have exactly the same dose, duration, etc. for cognitive behavioral therapy, 12 sessions, small group, and MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, 12 sessions, small group. And one of the one of the benefits of randomized controlled trials is that if done well, you can make much stronger inferences about change, the efficacy of a treatment, and perhaps even mediators, or the mechanisms, and moderators, features of the participants at baseline that help understand and predict who will and will not benefit. Because we don't assume that everyone's going to benefit from cognitive therapy. And we also do not assume, and we know, not everyone benefits from mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's also important to note that MBSR is one program, and it teaches a set of practices, but there are many, many other types of meditation training practices besides mindfulness.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because sometimes people can get the view that meditation is a panacea. It will cover anything that ails you. This will take care of it. And we grasp after cures, whether it's meditation or a particular kind of pseudoscience or a scientific treatment that may be the inappropriate one for the particular problem that they're having. It's important to note that you need to use the appropriate treatment for the condition and that individual and what they respond to best.
I wish there was something that worked for everyone.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is not the case. Therefore, it behooves us to have multiple methods and tools and to do our best to understand on an individual basis who will benefit from what training or what sequence of training.
Now, what are some of the most interesting findings in the studies that you've done? What are some things that have surprised you most that you perhaps weren't expecting?
Well, one thing was that aerobic exercise did, for at least for adults with anxiety disorders, did very, very well, just as well on self-report measures, meaning questionnaires of clinical symptoms and a whole bunch of measures of well-being compared to MBSR. Both were equally effective when looking at self-report data. So that was surprising, and that's good. In terms of another level, looking at functional MRI or brain responses when working with one's own negative self-beliefs, there we found very clear differences. In the randomized controlled trial, after the MBSR, the adults with social anxiety were more able to use a attention strategy to downregulate their reactivity, their emotional response to their own negative self-beliefs compared to the aerobic exercise group, showing that they learned some skill that appeared both in self-report inside the MRI scanner and also in the brain in terms of being able to engage their attention in a much more specific way.
And what are some of the things that have come up during the studies that you really were expecting? This is not a surprise to you, but that don't seem to be very well socialized knowledge about how the brain works. What kinds of things are you seeing that you were expecting, people just don't seem to realize?
Well, one thing that I'm working on a paper right now is on self-referential processing, or how one views and relates to oneself. And one of the nice things in neuroscience, human neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, is that, in fact, it converges from an empirical basis with some of the Buddhist views that there is no such thing as a self. There is no concrete individual entity called a self in the brain or anywhere in the body. It's construct, constantly refreshed, reproduced from moment to moment, and that there are many different versions and flavors of the self. You can see that really clearly in the brain. There's a wonderful set of meta-analyses that have found when you're doing conceptual self-view, thinking about yourself and having a mental representation, you see it very clearly in several midline cortical structures in the brain. One of the things we found with pre-post MBSR is changes in that self-referential circuit. So that, in fact, when considering myself in a positive view or a negative view, there's a region right behind the eyes called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, where we see a dissociation, where we actually see that a decrease in activity there when engaging in negative self-view after MBSR. So this is something that we're still trying to figure out what exactly it means, but it's an area that's been shown to be related to emotion processing, to lots of vulnerabilities during development in humans, and it's an area that's very important in terms of regulating other deeper emotion-related brain regions like the amygdala. So it suggests that at least one of the possible effects in mindfulness training is that it begins to modify aspects or automatic aspects of recruiting conceptual self-view. It seems to tone that down, and specifically for negative self-view. So this is actually really interesting because obviously the view of self, both gross and subtle, is the basis for lots of our cognitive biases, even our attentional biases, etc. So it's probably more fundamental than many of the other brain systems, I would say, at least cognitive brain systems.
One of the things we had talked about in email while we were setting up the interview is this idea of how the concept of placebo even has a place or doesn't have a place in these kinds of studies. We see in our skeptical community, of which I'm a part, that there's often a very dismissive attitude towards self-reported changes in these studies. And I was wondering if you could talk for a few minutes about what some of the challenges are with that sort of thing, that placebo requires being blind to the intervention, and that's not necessarily possible with clinical interventions.
This is true. When a person is in a clinical trial where they're receiving a medication, there you have the possibility, not 100% guaranteed, that you could take a pill and you don't know what it is. However, even in those studies, we know that there are certain profiles of side effects that probably would indicate that I'm on medication A versus B, or a placebo. In trials where we give people psychotherapy or meditation, etc., they're not blind. They know what they're training in. So there, what becomes important is having two active training programs where they control for variables that you think are not important or are important, but they leave an active ingredient in one training program and not the other. That takes a lot of forethought and work to set up well. And the other thing about placebo is that placebo also involves, in many cases, belief. So even if someone is getting a pill, many people get better. Why? Not because of the inert, non-active pill, but because of their belief. And that's something in human animals that's very powerful. Prefrontal cortex allows us to actually generate and hold representations of, I think I will be better because I'm doing this. I believe that I will be better. I expect that I will be better because I'm showing up in a class, in a program, and practicing something. So that part of belief or expectancy is something that we measure in our studies. And that could be just as powerful for just a simple aerobic exercise or even just a bibliography, bibliotherapy program. So it's important to try to measure that by looking at expectation effects, ratings of how much I believe a treatment will benefit me. But you cannot really remove a placebo. You can't really do placebo with humans who are entering into a course or training because they know what they're getting usually.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges that we face in our kind of practice is that we know from experience as meditators that because I do this, I know what's going in my mind, I'm better at observing it, I catch myself observing it more, but that's totally inside my own skull. That's myself. It's not something that we can externally verify. And that is one of the challenges that we face, but I think we have an opportunity in some studies which start with a baseline and doing, say, neural imaging, and then at the end of the study, do the neural imaging again to show a delta.
Yes, there are neuroimaging tools, for example, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or EEG, where in fact you can, from moment to moment, determine whether a person is or is not attending to an external stimulus. You can actually see that in the brain, and in many cases, unless a person is very, very highly trained, they are not, in fact, that insightful about their own inner experience. In fact, in many cases, the brain speaks more clearly than self-report. Not always. It depends on the context and what the exact measurement is. But in some cases, we use the metaphor, let the brain speak for itself, in those cases where it's much faster and much clearer than people's own internal awareness.
One other area of work that you do that I'd like you to talk about for a few minutes is child-parent mindfulness meditation training on anxiety, compassion, and quality of family interactions. Tell us more about that, because we don't see a great deal of study of how parent and child relationships and mindfulness practice can impact those relationships.
Yeah, there's more and more interest in impacting or training people at a younger age. The brain is more plastic, more pliable. Another aspect is training a whole family. So we actually did a study of mindfulness meditation training for parents and their 8 to 12-year-old kids. And it worked out rather well, I would say. Empirically, the parents showed many more benefits than the kids. And it's known that in general it's quite hard to find changes in self-report or even on computer tasks, especially reaction time tasks in children. That being said, still there was some evidence of improved ability to regulate attention in the children who did the mindfulness-based stress reduction program versus the weightless control. In terms of compassion, there's growing interest in the clinical field and also research on cultivating specific aspects of compassion or forms of compassion, compassion for the self, compassion for other, compassion for all beings. And there are many different practices to cultivate those qualities and seeing how that literally impacts people, healthy adults, people with anxiety, etc. So we are actively examining that right now, and we've just finished a big randomized controlled trial of compassion cultivation training in a community sample and found lots of evidence of improved ability to regulate emotions, to feel socially connected with others as opposed to isolated, and increasing the ability to express compassion and caring for others, for the self, and even for being the object of compassion. So that's an active area all over. That's happening now in many areas, many research labs.
Interesting. So if people would like to find out more about some of these studies, you can go to the website for Clinically Applied Effective Neuroscience. The address for that is caan.stanford.edu. And we've been speaking with Dr. Philippe Goldin. Philippe, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at www.secularbuddhistassociation.com, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaisa Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.